Hello, everybody. This is your professor, Aaron Rosari. Welcome back. Last week, we looked at Rebecca Dresser's article entitled Dworkin on Dementia. So, Ronald Dworkin is a famous bioethicist, as famous as bioethicists get, or influential, I think would be the better way of saying that. And he wrote a book that dealt a lot with end of life decision making. And one of the things he argued is that a person's advance directive really needs to be followed. And he argued for this, if you recall, based on a distinction between a person's critical interests on the one hand and their experiential interests on the other. So a person's critical interests, you could think of it as their set of values that guide their overall life decisions, people they want to spend time with, whether or not they want to have a family, vocations to pursue, what their hobbies are, um, projects they find meaningful. So those are one's critical interests. And he said a person's advance directive, because it's written when the person is fully intellectually competent, that document captures those critical interests. Now, alongside critical interests are what are called experiential interests, and that's your day-to-day enjoyments of the activities you partake in. That could be having a conversation with a friend, that could be hiking the woods, that could be playing guitar, that could be teaching a philosophy course. So it's just your day-to-day enjoyments. Now, obviously, there's not too sharp a distinction between the two, as our overarching set of values guides the activities we choose day to day. Okay. But what happens in the case of a person such as Margo, who remember is actually a hypothetical person, but she's in a realistic scenario? So, Margo, when she was fully mentally competent, she wrote what is called an advance directive. It's a document that lays out what she would like to have happen to her, medically speaking, if certain things were to befall her, including suffering from Alzheimer's. So over time, Alzheimer's decreases a person's mental capacities. And Margo was of the opinion when she wrote her advance directive that she wouldn't want to stay alive with a greatly diminished set of intellectual capacities. But that's the state she's in now. If you recall, she can experience very pleasant moments, listening to music, having conversation, playing simple games, but she doesn't remember who people are, including her own family. Uh, and she has no deep history of her own, deep memory of her own history, her past. So she's like this somewhat simple creature living day to day, moment by moment, in a series of disconnected moments, but she's pretty content in those moments as a rule. So she's not living a life of fear. She's not being mistreated. She's being well provided for. And her day-to-day happiness levels are quite high. So this raises the question, should we, one, follow Margot's advance directive? Or should someone take into account, well, actually, even though Margot's life isn't the way she would have wanted it to be, I don't think anyone would choose that simple of a life. It's still, at least from Margot's perspective, in her present state, a very good life. It's filled with a lot more joy and peace and pleasant interactions than anything else. So, should we be a little bit paternalistic and ignore her advance directive, or is Dworkin correct that a person's critical interest, their guiding set of values, kind of overrides the fact that they're now happy in the moment, even though they're not living the sort of life they would have chosen to live when fully competent? So that's the set of issues we're talking about. Last week, we looked at a lot of Dworkin's arguments for the view that we ought to follow the advance directives. And again, his basic point is one's critical interests are more important than their experiential interests. And now we're going to look at Dresser's counter arguments to Dworkin. She thinks the opposite. We ought to follow, uh, we ought to take into account and weight more heavily Margot's day-to-day experiential interests instead of continuing to value her critical interests. Let's see why she thinks that and dive into some of these arguments. Okay, as you'll see, once again, I have taken the path of simply responding to the reading questions. I've done that in written form. If at this point you want to just go read what I wrote, and maybe that's a more efficient path for you, I always preferred that path myself when given the choice. You are free to do that. You can shut down the video, read my responses, compare them to your own. I'll probably do a little bit of more explaining here, but I also tried to make my own written responses pretty robust. So yeah, if you prefer to do this in a written format, you are free to do so. Okay, so maybe a little tedious, but we're gonna go just kind of read through the questions, and then we're gonna read through my responses to them. And again, the goal here is to see if you were able to comprehend the material yourself the first time through. Um, Hoping you're picking up the skill of reading fairly sophisticated arguments and kind of tracing those arguments through the text. I'm sure you're picking that up. I'm sure you're improving on it. So that's why we do this every week. Okay. So the first question starts off with a little background and intro, and we kind of covered it. Dworkin had argued that Margot's advance directive should be followed because it represents her critical interests, and Dworkin thinks critical interests are more important than experiential. The advance directive calls for Margo to be euthanized when she develops Alzheimer's. So let's be clear, to euthanize a person is to kill them. Painlessly, hopefully, but kill them nonetheless. So Dresser begins her arguments against Dworkin's position on page 34 in the section entitled Advanced Directives and Precedent Autonomy. Okay, so in the first paragraph of this section, Dresser notes that very few Americans have an advance directive which specifies the sort of care they should receive if they were to experience a decline in mental competence. So, question A, how does Dresser use this fact to challenge Dworkin's claim that people's critical interests are more important to them than their experiential interests? Well, this is pretty straightforward. So look at what I've written in A here. If people are not even spending time putting together an advance directive, it follows that people do not value mapping out how their life will unfold under conditions of illness. And this undermines Dworkin's idea that people are more concerned about having their critical interests met than their experiential interests. Now, of course, this is a little bit of an oversimplification. It's also possible that people do value how their life would go under conditions of illness and mapping that out, but maybe they're kind of afraid to, or maybe they don't feel the urgency in doing so. These are all possibilities. But I think Dresser's point stands. If people were really so concerned about this, then they would put time into it and they would get it done. But people tend not to put much time into this at all, as we shall see. So maybe people aren't as wrapped up in having their overall pattern of life go to a certain pattern that matches their values if they're not putting the time into saying what those values are and how these should play out under conditions of illness. All right, this leads us to question B. In the second, third, and fourth paragraphs in this section, Dresser lists several things a person who is writing an advance directive should be informed of regarding what it is like to have Alzheimer's. What is on the list? Okay, so people writing an advance directive should understand that the experience of dementia differs from person to person. For some, dementia is generally frightening, but most people are not distressed or miserable. Later on in the paragraph, Dresser notes that the quality of a person's life with Alzheimer's depends more on the environment they are in and how they are cared for than the illness itself. People should also know that the illness is progressive and that decline occurs in stages. They should also know what interventions there are and how invasive these interventions are. Okay, so part of Dresser's point is like, look, if you're going to do an advanced directive, do it right. Learn about the illnesses you're going to talk about in that directive, learn about possible treatments, learn about the quality of life. On average, obviously, it varies from person to person during those times. And if you're not going to do that, um, then you're not really covering your bases. You're not really mapping out in a reasonable way what your care should look like. And again, she only has occasion to make these points because very few people do this. And in relation to question A, it kind of undermines the claim that we should automatically think that a person's critical interests dominate their experiential. All right, question C. Does the average person put a lot of effort into writing an advanced directive? Well, this is kind of a throwback to A. We've already answered it. No. The average person puts very little time indeed into writing an advanced directive. They are sometimes put together during interviews that last 15 minutes, and very little study of common illnesses is undertaken, and inconsistent content is sometimes supplied. All right. Um, and D is actually a little bit redundant with A. So sorry about that, but basically, we've already answered it in A. Basically, the fact that people put very little time into. Actually, this is a different question. Sorry. The fact that people put very little time into um, making an advanced directive, what that means is it reduces their authority. Um, so A was about the relative balance of critical and experiential interest. Sorry, that's actually a different question. Related question. But in relation to question D, we shouldn't place all that much authority in an advanced directive that was hastily thrown together in ignorance of what living with a specific illness actually entails. Um, so yeah, that's basically the answer there. And you could see why. I mean, if the idea here is to maximize rational decision making, but if a person is making decisions with poor information, their own process isn't really that rational. So if we're in a position where we're to decide on the best care for them because they can no longer decide it for themselves, this would certainly decrease the level of authority we should accord the advance directive. Okay, question two. On page 35, in the paragraph that begins personal identity theory, and in the following paragraphs, Dresser makes a second argument against Dworkin's view that Margo's advance directive should be followed. Uh, does Dworkin assume that Margo before her decline is the same person as Margo after her decline? And part B, does Dresser agree with Dworkin, or does she challenge the assumption he makes regarding personal identity through time in relation to Margo? So Dworkin does assume that the Margo who wrote the directive is the same Margo who is declining from Alzheimer's. Dresser challenges this assumption based on the work of philosophers who study personal identity and the changes that people can undergo and remain the same person over time. One common view is that our personal identity is grounded in psychological traits, such as our memories, our values, and other personality traits. Are we introverted? Are we extroverted? Are we funny? Um, are we generally well informed? Are, are we more of a feeler? Are we more of a thinker? Are we more introverted, more extroverted? It's not clear at all how much rapid change a person can survive in relation to these traits without literally becoming a different person. So if you ever have an opportunity to take a intro to philosophy course, at least in mine and many others, you might end up spending several weeks on this issue of personal identity. Um, so let me just give you a quick thought experiment. It's actually based on a real person. There's this person named Phineas Gage. He used to work on the Transcontinental Railroad when it was being built. There was a horrible accident. A pipe was blown through his frontal cortex. And overnight, he underwent radical personality change. He went from being mild-mannered, dependable, calm, polite, to being kind of rowdy, impulsive, kind of mean to other people, very abrupt. He used to be very self-controlled, and then after he kind of became really into drinking. And all these radical shifts occurred pretty quickly. Um, Now, a lot of people would argue that Phineas Gage after the accident is literally not the same person as Phineas Gage before the accident. That's debatable. It's not clear, but that is a common view. So, and Dresser, she realizes there's a lot of debate in this area. So she just points out, look, this is not obviously true, that Margo at time one is the same person as Margo at time two. So there might literally be two people here at different times, and that affects the amount of authority we should put in the advanced directive because the person who wrote it wouldn't actually be speaking for themselves. They'd be literally speaking for another person. So that's the idea there. Okay, so question three. This question pertains to the section entitled Critical and Experiential Interests, Problems with the Model. It starts on page 35. Dresser argues against Dworkin's view that if someone like Margo failed to write an advance directive, that a surrogate decision maker, in other words, the person making decisions on Margo's behalf, such as a family member, should make decisions in relations to Margo's critical interests as opposed to her day-to-day experiential interests. For example, let's say her longtime husband had good reason to think that Margo, before her mental decline, would judge that she would not want to live with advanced Alzheimer's. According to Dworkin, the husband could decide to euthanize Margo, even if Margo had a happy day-to-day existence. Dworkin believes this because, again, he thinks people value their critical interests over their experiential ones. And in the absence of an advanced directive, the person who would be in the best position to figure out Margo's critical interest would be someone who knew her extraordinarily well. Okay. Question A. Does Dresser think that this assumption that people value their critical interest over their experiential interest is well evidenced, or does she think it lacks evidence? Basically, Margo points out, she doesn't just think this, but she points out we don't have any evidence for this assumption. Indeed, she argues that for all we know, people have the critical interests they have because they expect that pursuing a specific pattern of life will fulfill their day-to-day experiential interests. So, for example, let's say one day you go out and you experience rock climbing for the first time and you really enjoy it, and you're like, I'd like to enjoy this for many, many years to come. So part of your critical interest comes one of your critical interests becomes learning how to rock climb. Well, here everything's flipped on its head. This is Dresser's point. It's you so enjoyed the activity, you want to have those enjoyments over and over. So your experiential interests are forging your critical interests. So maybe, for all we know, that's how most people see these things. They choose their critical interests in light of their experiential ones, not vice versa. In any case, Margo, I'm not Margo. Oh, I put the wrong person here. I meant Dresser. I'll fix that for the written when I post it. Dresser thinks we actually have zero evidence for this assumption. Okay. Part B, what important argument does Dresser say Dworkin failed to address in relation to the claim that Margot's critical interests are more important to her than her experiential interests are? Okay. Well, the argument that Dworkin fails to address is that since Margo doesn't really have critical interests when her Alzheimer's becomes extreme, that her experiential interests are far more important. Now, here I put a little commentary I think this is a devastating argument for Dworkin's view. Feel free to disagree, but just think about it for a second. This is a devastating argument since he thinks that Margot's past critical interests, which no longer even exist, are somehow more important to Margo now than her present experiential interests, which are quite real. Um, and that's the basic point that Dresser is making. Look, the current Margo doesn't have critical interests. She has no grand perspective on her day-to-day life and the shape it should take. So why are we saying that her critical interests ought to determine her fate when they don't even exist anymore? It's past tense Margo who had these, but that Margo is not really around anymore, at least not in the same critical interest having form. And Dworkin apparently, in his full-length book, doesn't address this counterargument. Okay. Question C. Does Dresser think it would be an easy task to identify what Margot's critical interests are? And again, this is kind of assuming she doesn't have an advanced directive, or maybe she has one that's poorly written. But the immediate context here is she didn't write one. And the answer here is Dresser thinks it would be very hard indeed to ascertain what Margot's critical interests are. First, this is not language that people use day to day. You don't go around talking about your critical interests versus your experiential interests. Um, so Margo would never have simply stated what her critical interests are. Um, Relatives or or close friends or someone who knew her well would have to infer her critical interests from activities she pursued and what they took her values to be. But people are complex, so it would not be clear what values dominate. Um, yeah, so good luck trying to figure out what her critical interests were, or if she would have wanted to remain alive in in a late stage Alzheimer's state. Dresser just thinks, evidence for this would be very iffy. And when that happens, if you think about it, what people would do is they'd project their own values onto Margo, and that would be hard not to do if the evidence of Margo's own interests, what her critical interests actually are, are kind of weak. So that's troubling in itself. Okay. Um, all right. Thanks for I'm gonna go post a discussion board now. So that'll be due Monday night. And keep up the good work, and I'll see you all soon. All right, take care.